Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about dual-toned art or two-tone art, which is something that's been used for ages and ages to kind of bring out the highlights and shadows and give a really cool effect. So normally, no matter how realistic or simplified an artwork is, you're going to be using some sort of warmer color, so your reds, your oranges, your yellows, your pinks, anything in that warm color range for your highlights, and then any of the cool colors for your shadows, so your blues, your purples, dark greens, etc. For your project, you're going to be doing a more simplified version, kind of like this portrait of Abraham Lincoln, but you will be doing a portrait. So go to Pexels, find a copyright-free image of a person, or if you have a picture that you've taken yourself that's really good quality of a person, you're welcome to do that. How much that person is showing is totally up to you. This was the image that I went with, and there are a few things that I might have changed about which image I chose, and I'll get into that in a second. But your first step is going to be to duplicate the layer, so you always have your original image as the background layer, and we are going to turn this duplicated layer into a black and white version of itself. So if you don't know how to do that, that's going to be under Adjustments, Black and White. And then the issue that I ran into is one of the next steps is going to be to use the Select and Mask tool to essentially mask out the background from your foreground subject. We want just our foreground, our subject, our person to be showing. So it was important to me to give this image as much contrast as possible because there are some issues where the dress kind of fades into the background and the crown and the hair was a bit hard to cut out. So keep that in mind as you're choosing your photo, what type of issues you might run into whenever you are trying to remove the background. One thing you can do as well is go to Adjustment Levels or Command L or Control L if you're on a PC, and you can make the darks, pull in the darks to make the darks darker and the brights brighter. You are not going to be seeing the photo by the end of this project. So it doesn't have to be perfect in terms of how you want the photo to show. It just needs to be good in terms of cutting out or removing the background and working from the highlights and shadows on your image. I did go ahead and duplicate this layer just so if I ever needed to go back to it, I had a version of it that was untouched. So go ahead and duplicate that layer so you have another black and white copy, and this is when we're going to do the Select and Mask option to get rid of the background. If you need help remembering how to do this process, you can go ahead and watch this. If not, you can skip to 5:45 for the next steps. Make sure that your output settings at the bottom right of that section is to layer mask, so it creates that layer mask instead of actually deleting the background. We are going to duplicate that layer, but you'll see me on screen. I add a layer over top of that, which we're going to get to in a second. But first thing first, go ahead and duplicate that entire layer with the black and white image and the layer mask. Now on your duplicated version, you are going to apply a filter. So the filter you're going to be using is the cutout, quote unquote, so that it creates these different layers of basically values of your image. So you can play around with the number of layers depending on your image, what's going to work for you, but that is going to help you find out where the brightest areas are and darkest areas are, because sometimes just looking at the photo alone, even though it's in black and white, it's hard to pick those out. So that's just an additional assistance to you. Now it's time to decide on your two colors that you're going to use, the brighter color or warmer color for the highlight and the darker or cooler color for the shadows. Now for me, I went with this sort of lime green. Green is a color that is kind of split between the warm and cool colors, but if you have more yellow in it, it leans warm. If you have more blue in it, it leans cool. I do recommend using the Wacom tablet or Procreate for this if you have an iPad. But you're going to paint on with your brighter color, whatever you've chosen, the warmer color, over top of your highlights. And again, this needs to be on its own layer, so make sure you're on a new layer, and you're kind of just blocking out sections of highlight here. I really like the paintbrush that tapers off at the end whenever you ease up on the pressure, and then gets fatter whenever you press harder with the Wacom tablet. So make sure you have that on if that is the style that you would like to go for. I do have this very much sped up in terms of how much time it took, so this is a long, arduous process. You will probably have to undo a lot if you are like me and redo, but we can always come back and tweak this as long as it's on its own layer. I flipped between personally having the cutout filtered version beneath versus the photo. Sometimes it was easier for me to see the sections like on the face, especially where I wanted the highlights, versus if I had the photo on, kind of figuring out where that section of highlight or shadow ended. To skip ahead a little, I'm going to show you some parts of the picture that were super detailed and very tedious, but the more detail that you add and actually capture the highlights and shadows of, the better your final image is going to look. However, there are different styles, so you can choose how detailed you want to go. But for me, the crown was a really important part of this image, so I wanted to make sure I included that. Later on down the line, I did have some earrings that included some details of the highlights and shadows, but not a whole lot, because those were less important to me. I also had a hard time masking out. You can see some of the background is still showing in this image. If you have any really detailed sections like this, make sure that you go back in later, even if you don't do it from the start, and take out the background with whatever method you need to use. What I did was I just cut and pasted a copy of the crown on a new layer and made it super dark or super highly contrasted. The dark super dark, the bright super brights, so I could go in with the selection tool and mask out or delete out those sections of the background in between the little curving details of the crown. Now, if that didn't quite make sense, it's okay, you can call me over for more clarification, but essentially what you need to know is by the end of this, that layer that has the layer mask attached to it, you want to think about it as a silhouette. So I need the holes in my crown to be cut out of that silhouette. So that's what I'm doing now. So think about if there are any additional or outside elements to your portrait, around the clothing, the jewelry, anything like that, a hat, something that needs to be included in the silhouette or excluded. If you are ready to go to the next step, it is to add on a new layer, your dark colors, okay, so your cool colors. So I'm going to be doing the same thing that I did for my highlights, but for my shadows, and you can skip ahead to see this at 1322. So like I was saying, your next step is to go in and add your cool color tone to the darkest areas of your image. And you're going to do this exactly like you did with your warmer tone, except on a new layer and you're looking at the darkest spots. So again, I flipped between the photo black and white image and the filtered black and white image of the different layers to kind of see where the darkest parts are sectioned off. You can do this as it works for you. You can flip back and forth if you'd like I do. But essentially, that is the next step. Okay, for the last few steps, I'm going to try and cover them all in one hit. First of all, it's just one, cleaning up your mistakes. A lot of my green, especially because it was the first time I'd done this, I didn't really care for how it came out. I probably should have cleaned it up more, but I went ahead and adjusted some of the areas. And then also whenever I went in, I had some issues with my layer mask. It wasn't quite perfect, so I wanted to make some adjustments on that. So fix anything you can from that point. But the next step is actually going to be to create a layer over top of your layer with the layer mask and pick a sort of middle ground color and fill that layer and then make that layer a clipping mask down onto that layer with the layer mask on it. Sorry, I know it's a lot of the repetitive words, but you're just clipping that color so again it forms that silhouette. That is going to show you more issues with either your warmer color, cooler color, or your mask. So I had to again go in and clean up some of those issues. Once that's all to your liking, you can also play around with the coloring. If you make an hue saturation adjustment layer on top of everything. You can either clip it to just one thing if you want to change one color and see how it looks, or you can not clip to anything and it'll change all the colors at one time. And by playing around with this, I did change my colors just a bit from what I originally had. You're welcome to do this as well. And then the last thing I did was to make my background, which you're going to do as well. So as you can see, I've got the background layers turned off, so it's a blank slate and I can kind of play with it how I want. I use the pen tool and the fill paint bucket to make my kind of rays in the background. Did some final adjustments, and that is my final product. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck. Have fun.